Our New Testament reading for today comes from the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I remember when I was the age of some of our scouts here, learning a little bit about American history and some of the explorers and expeditions that were sent out to expand and explore the western part of the United States. One of those expeditions was, of course, that of Lewis and Clark. They were commissioned, it was a military expedition, to find what was called the Northwest Passage, a waterway that was believed to exist that would connect the Atlantic Ocean on the east all the way to the Pacific Ocean on the west. And people were anxious to find that waterway because that was going to open the west to commercial and new people living there. Now, they expected, based on everything that could be known and was known at that time, that there was going to be a river system that would allow them to take canoes and canoe up to the headwaters of the rivers on the east side of the Continental Divide, and then maybe with a little bit of effort, take it across some plains or some low-lying rolling hills, much as you might find on the East Coast, and then take the canoes down the west side to the Pacific Ocean. It was a good plan until they hit the Rocky Mountains. And they realized that they were not going to be able to canoe those mountains. They had to find another way. And so they traded in their canoes for horses and hiking boots. But it wasn't just that. They had to trade in the way that they were going to travel, but they also had to trade in the way that they were organized and that they approached it. This is called adaptive leadership for those of you that are in those areas of practice. They had to trade in the way that they were organized. It's a military organization with people who were up at the leaders who had all the expertise and the knowledge and the authority, and all of a sudden they find themselves in uncharted territory, having to rely on people they met along the way and trust them to be their guides. People from different cultures figure out how to overcome the language barriers, listen to people like Sacagawea with a baby on her back. A very different kind of expedition that did ultimately find the Pacific coast, but not the way that they expected it. Our disciples, Jesus' earliest followers, were spiritual explorers of a way. They were commissioned, called to look for lost people and help them find their way back to God, not to the Pacific Ocean, but to find their way back to God. And they expected, based on everything they could know at that time about God and about themselves and about how their religion was organized, they expected that they would continue to do that kind of work under the assumption that they, as good Jews, would continue to follow the law, that was the way to find your way to God, until Jesus hit them with the news that the way to God was through the cross. Jesus told his disciples that time had come. He was going to Jerusalem, where he would be put to death and then rise again. And if the disciples wanted to be his disciples, they were going to need to take up their own crosses and follow after Jesus. That announcement from Jesus changed everything. This was something on a greater magnitude, something larger than simply trading out your canoes for some horses and hiking boots. This was going to be dealing without any kind of human way of transportation at all. Jesus was talking now about trading in the way that they understood religion to work. That the way to God in the past may have been under the law. Now, moving forward in the future, the way to God was going to be following Jesus and putting your faith and trust in Jesus and others who Jesus calls, people you may not know, people you're going to have to put your trust in to follow you on a path that may not be knowable. And so we come to our text then, reading in verse 1, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And the first thing we got to do is get past a verse that starts 6 days later. That seems an odd place for a lectionary reading to begin, because it begs the question, well, what happened 6 days before we get to this text? And so we are compelled to go back and unearth some of the context so that we can understand this text that we read this morning. And if we look back a few verses, we will find this announcement by Jesus that he is going to Jerusalem, and the disciples are stunned by this news. We know they're stunned because they react in ways that are very dramatic. This is where we find the text of Peter rebuking Jesus and saying, Lord, that can't possibly happen. And Jesus famously saying, get behind me, Satan, right? This is what happens before they go up the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus saying, whoever would follow me must first lose their lives for my sake, and then they will find their own. And so now, 6 days later, after all of that, Peter and James and John follow Jesus up the mountain. They're there to pray and to prepare for this new way of finding their way to God. Verse 2, and Jesus was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Peter and James and John were not expecting that to happen. They would have been aware of Old Testament passages and references to the glory of God shining on people and being radiated or reflected back off of them, like Moses radiating the glory of God. But now, talking about the light, like a flashlight that goes through your very flesh, that light transfiguring Jesus, glowing from the inside out, a complete transformation. Or it might have been like the light that we sometimes hear people who describe near-death experiences, or who have been witnesses at bedsides as people pass. And they talk about that thin space between this life and the next, and that's always described in terms of a light that is visible between this world and the next when you are in that thin space. We don't know what that light looked like, but we know that suddenly, within these events, suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Peter was channeling his inner scout here. He was prepared for anything. And if we look back on the origins of that motto of the Scout, we find that the Scout founder, Robert Baden-Powell, was asked in the early part of the last century, well, what are Scouts supposed to be prepared for? And his response was, well, for any old thing. And Peter, prepared for any old thing, says, Lord, it's a good thing we're here. Would you like me to pitch some tents for you? Peter, scholars suggest, may also have been thinking, we're not going to have to go through the cross, right? He's looking for a way to avoid the hard work of what Jesus is describing, what it's going to take to be a follower. And Peter is doing the math, and he's thinking, I'm in the presence of someone who has clearly been transfigured by the light of God, in the presence of people who are already residents of heaven, that being Moses and Elijah, who have passed long ago. Let's just stay here. Let's pitch some tents, and we'll go straight to heaven without having to go through the cross. And before the words are even out of Peter's mouth, what do we hear? That out of the cloud from heaven, the voice of God saying, no. Follow Jesus. Listen to him. This is my beloved Son. Verse 5, while Peter was still speaking, a voice from the cloud said, this is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. This goes straight to the heart of our Christian faith, the good news that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son to die at the cross for our sake and in our place. And these words might sound familiar to us. They echo the words of the baptism, a time when another voice spoke from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son. That was the revelation of the divine relationship between Jesus and God, God the Father, God the Son. Now here on the Mount of Transfiguration, we have the completion of that. We have not just the relationship, but the divine authority being gifted to Jesus. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And as those words are being spoken, it is underscored by the fact that who's disappearing at the same time? Moses, who represented the law, and Elijah, the greatest of the prophets. Verse 6, when the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. Well, of course, you've just heard God say, listen to him. You'd be overcome with fear thinking, okay, I think I heard correctly. All of a sudden you have been moved from a paradigm under the law where things are spelled out. Under the law, you've got 10 commandments and all of the laws, and they are all specified. Even if you can't possibly follow all of them, at least they're there and you can use them as the rubric for determining how you are going to move through life. And now, the way is by following Jesus and listening to him. Well, what's that going to entail? This is slightly scarier, a lot edgier, perhaps even more difficult in some respects. What if we don't hear everything he's saying? What if we hear it wrong? It is scarier for them. And this listen to him language is not a suggestion from God. Listen to him. It's the kind of hearing which is something that does more than just goes in our ears. It implies a response, an action that will follow that listening. And listen to him isn't just the kind of hearing that goes in one ear and out the other. It's a continuing kind of hearing. Keep on listening. Keep on listening. And the disciples are overwhelmed. They're on the ground. They are afraid. afraid. Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. This is now the way, following Christ. On the ground, where we find ourselves, in whatever spiritual ditch we have driven ourselves into or been kicked into or pushed aside and into, the life that we live in our day, on the ground. And here is Jesus there reaching out to help us, to comfort us, to heal us, to be there in whatever way that we need. This is the model of Christian discipleship. And when everyone else abandons us, who leaves us behind, and there is no one in our lives who isn't going to disappoint us in some way at some point, Jesus never fails us. Jesus, when nobody else is there, Jesus is still there to reach out and say, "Do not be afraid." And they looked up and they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. Jesus, who, as we read on in the text, walks with the disciples back down the mountain, through the valleys, on the way to Jerusalem, even to the cross. Jesus, who is with them every single step of the way. Jesus, who is with all of us every day, every step of the way. Jesus, who is the way and the truth and the life.